This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Mr. Poilievre, seconded by Mr. Lobb, moved that the House call on the Liberal government to immediately repeal the carbon tax on farmers, First Nations, and families.
Participating in person wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair. The Honourable Member for Perth Wellington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We request a recorded division.
Yay. Call in the members.
Check around 3 a.m. see how everybody is. The question is as follows. Monsieur Poilievre, seconded by Mr. Lobb, move that the House call on the Liberal government to immediately repeal the carbon tax on farmers, First Nations, and families. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically is started in the House and now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Halland.
Mr. Halland.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Duncan Stormadunda South Glengarry.
Mr. Duncan Stormadunda South Glengarry.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Ms. Finley.
Miss Finley.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abultayev.
Mr. Abultayev.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Godin.
Mr. Godin.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Melillo.
Mr. Melillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Chambers.
Mrs. Cramp Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp Nyman.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Law.
Mr. Law.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Mazier.
Mr. Mazier.
Mr. Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Mr. Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Couric.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmy.
Mr. Tolmy.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Khanna.
Mr. Khanna.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Leslie.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Ms. Gould.
Ms. Gould.
Mr. Macaulay Cardigan.
Mr. Macaulay Cardigan.
Mr. Sagen.
Mr. Sagen.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. O'Regan.
Mr. O'Regan.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Duclos.
Monsieur Duclos.
Ms. Ing.
Ms. Ing.
Mr. Rodriguez.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Mr. Leblanc.
Monsieur Leblanc.
Ms. Freeland.
Miss Freeland.
Ms. Anand.
Ms. Anand.
Mr. Wilkinson.
Mr. Wilkinson.
Mr. Fraser.
Mr. Fraser.
Mr. Boissonneau.
Monsieur Boissonneau.
Ms. Hutchings.
Miss Hutchings.
Ms. Tassi.
Miss Tassi.
Mr. Varani.
Mr. Varani.
Ms. Sachs.
Miss Sachs.
Ms. Suds.
Miss Suds.
Ms. Bennett.
Miss Bennett.
Ms. Chager.
Miss Jager.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. McKay.
Ms. Crow.
Miss Crow.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Vandal.
Monsieur Vandal.
Ms. Cara.
Miss Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Ms. Haidu.
Miss Haidu.
Mr. Miller.
Monsieur Miller.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Ms. Ian.
Miss Ian.
Madame Le Boutillier.
Madame de Boutier.
Madame Bibot.
Madame Bibot.
Mr. Hussein.
Mr. Hussein.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Petipat-Taylor.
Mr. Hernandez Sangri.
Mr. Hernandez Sangri.
Mr. Beach.
Mr. Beach.
Madame Martinez Ferrada.
Madame Martinez Ferrara.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mrs. Valdez.
Ms. Jacek.
Miss Jazek.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Arsenault.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Mrs. Romanato.
Mrs. Romanato.
Mr. Sheehan.
Mr. Sheehan.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamuter.
Mr. Lamour.
Madame Bendayan.
Madame Bendayan.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Ms. DeBrusen.
Mr. Brusen.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Lozon.
Mr. Lozon.
Mr. Kuzmarchak.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Aria.
Mr. Aria.
Ms. Dillon.
Ms. Dillon.
Ms. Zerowitz.
Ms. Zerowitz.
Mr. El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Ms. DeMoff.
Ms. Demoff.
Mr. Souza.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Calloway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Serré.
Monsieur Serré.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Yakuno.
Monsieur Yacono.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Lightbound.
Monsieur Lightbound.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McKinnon, Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McKinnon. Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Shifke.
Monsieur Shifke.
Mr. Zuberi.
Monsieur Zuberi.
Ms. Hefner.
Miss Hefner.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Noor Mohammed.
Mr. Noor Mohammed.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Miss Cedar Brampton South.
Mrs. Aid.
Mrs. Zayed.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Miss Yip.
Mr. Alday.
Mr. Alday.
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Blois.
Mr. Blois.
Ms. Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Ali.
Mr. Ali.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Mr. Tahal.
Mr. Chahal.
Madame Chatel.
Madame Chatel.
Mr. Koto.
Mr. Koto.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Hanley.
Mr. Hanley.
Ms. Kayabaga.
Ms. Kayabaga.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Nakfi.
Ms. Taylor Roy.
Taylor Roy.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Ms. Gainey.
Ms. Gainey.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Perron.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Posé.
Madame Posé.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Ashton.
Ms. Ashton.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Ms. Idlout.
Ms. Idlout.
Mr. Canning.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Ms. Gazan.
Barron.
Ms. Barrett.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Collins Victoria.
Ms. Collins Victoria.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Davies.
Mr. Davies.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
La Chambre est en remettre.
The House will now wait for the end of the electronic voting period before resuming its proceedings.
wish to inform the House the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, I ask them to use the raise hand function. The chair will recognize them. Nobody ran in. The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 112, 112. Nays contre 202, 202.
I declare the motion defeated. House Leader for the Opposition is standing on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I was just wondering if I know you're not supposed to reflect on votes that were just happening. The House generally doesn't take the same question twice. But if the government does want to avoid a marathon voting session, all they have to do is take the carbon tax off of farmers, families, and First Nations.
That's not a point of order. So the question is on opposed vote number 1. The question is as follows. Do you think I can dispense the first one? I mean, this is an on, seconded by Ms. Kira, moves that vote 1B in the amount of $253,645 under the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency operating expenditures in the supplementary estimates B for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024 be concurred in. If a member participating in person wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I'd invite them to rise and indicate to the chair. The honourable member for Regina Capel.
I hereby request a recorded division, Mr. Speaker.
L'appel est dédié pour les députés votant par voie électronique.